August 1944. An open field west of Le Mans, France. Sunlight hits a completely flat stretch of pastureland spanning 200 meters wide. Grass sways under a summer breeze. Men lie in the dirt, their faces pressed against the earth. Tracers cut the air just inches above their helmets. A furious rattling noise dominates the landscape, rhythmic and endless. It is the sound of German automatic weapons tearing a battalion to pieces. 87 soldiers are down in less than 6 minutes. They are trapped in the wide open with zero cover, dying because of a single decision. The order came from an officer who refused to look at the ground in front of him. He looked at a manual from the previous century instead. General George S. Patton will deal with this tactical disaster by dismantling an old man's delusion. This is the story of a modern battalion forced to execute an ancient tactic across a deadly, open landscape. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities. Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski was 36 years old. He came from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and served with the 90th Infantry Division. Before the war, he worked in the steel mills, learning how heavy machinery operated and how metal behaved under pressure. He had already survived 2 brutal combat campaigns in North Africa and Sicily. Those campaigns taught him that modern warfare left no room for error. He had watched good friends die from simple mistakes, and he carried a deep scar across his shoulder from a shrapnel fragment. Kowalski was a pragmatic leader who respected the lethal reality of automatic weapons. He spent hours studying terrain maps, looking for sunken roads, tree lines, and ditches that could conceal his men from enemy view. He believed an NCO's true job was keeping his men alive while accomplishing the mission. On this clear August afternoon, he looked through his binoculars at a deadly stretch of open pasture and felt a heavy knot form in his stomach. Colonel Douglas Prescott was 48 years old. He came from Lexington, Kentucky, and commanded the infantry battalion. Before the global conflict erupted, Prescott had spent his entire military career in the traditional horse cavalry. He viewed the battlefield through the lens of old manuals, where galloping formations and overwhelming shock value decided the fate of nations. He wore a tailored service coat even in the field, and his leather boots were polished to a mirror shine by his orderly. His most prized possession was a leather riding crop, a souvenir from his days instructing at Fort Riley. He constantly tapped this crop against his leg whenever he issued directives to his subordinates. Prescott firmly believed that aggressiveness and rapid forward momentum could shatter any defensive line. He looked at the flat field west of Le Mans and saw a perfect opportunity to execute a classic mounted gasp maneuver. Completely ignoring the mechanical evolution of modern defense, the Allied advance across France had reached a critical turning point by the late summer of 1944. The German defensive lines were fracturing after the breakout from Normandy, causing chaotic retreats and sudden, desperate rearguard actions. American armored columns raced eastward to trap the enemy, creating a highly fluid battlefield where pockets of resistance could appear in any village or hedgerow. In this rapid movement, infantry units often found themselves operating beyond their traditional communication lines, forced to clear isolated strongpoints without immediate heavier assistance. The sheer speed of the offensive created massive logistical gaps, leaving frontline battalions to rely entirely on the judgment of their individual sector commanders. Many senior officers had spent decades training for stationary trench warfare or theoretical open-field maneuvers during the peacetime years, meaning they had never experienced the devastating reality of modern automatic fire. Higher command frequently overlooked minor tactical deviations as long as towns were captured, allowing old-fashioned habits to persist unchallenged within certain regiments. This lack of strict oversight allowed an outdated mentality to dictate live combat decisions on the road to Le Mans. The German forces took advantage of this aggressive momentum by establishing deeply concealed positions, equipped with heavy, belt-fed machine guns capable of covering massive sectors. These defensive positions were designed specifically to channel advancing infantry into wide, flat areas where maneuvering without adequate preparation meant absolute destruction. Smaller units usually adjusted by using smoke ammunition or requesting light tank support to blind these deadly emplacements before moving forward. But on this specific afternoon, the traditional chain of command silenced the practical warnings of the veterans who actually understood the ground. The stage was set for a disastrous display of unearned confidence in the middle of an open pastureland. Kowalski stood behind the low stone wall at the edge of the tree line, watching the colonel tap his leather riding crop against his freshly polished boot. The sergeant held the map out between them, pointing a calloused finger at a dark green band that curved around the northern edge of the pasture. He explained that the tree line provided a sunken lane with complete visual cover, allowing 2 rifle companies to move unseen into the flank of the German strongpoint. He noted that the field in front of them was an absolute killing zone, completely flat with interlocking fields of fire from at least 3 heavy machine guns. Prescott did not look at the map. He looked across the wide pasture, his chin held high, the silver insignia on his collar catching the bright afternoon sun. He told the sergeant that he had spent 15 years studying the great mobile campaigns of the past, and that speed and forward momentum were the only things that shattered an enemy's will to fight. He insisted that a rapid, aggressive advance in a single, unbroken line would overwhelm the defensive position before the gunners could react. Kowalski stepped closer, keeping his voice low but firm. He stated that these were not single-shot weapons from the old days, but belt-fed guns that could sweep the entire width of the meadow in seconds. He requested that they hold the battalion for 20 minutes to bring up the light tanks from the armored cavalry unit, or at least wait for the mortar platoon to lay down a heavy curtain of white phosphorus smoke to blind the German bunkers. Prescott raised his riding crop and pressed the leather tip directly against the center of Kowalski's chest, forcing the sergeant back a step. He stated that shock value had won every major engagement since the era of Napoleon, and that he refused to stall his advance for slow armor or hide his men behind a cloud of smoke. He added that he had not spent his career at Fort Riley to have his tactical decisions questioned by a steel mill worker from Pennsylvania. He ordered the sergeant to return to his platoon and prepare the men to move forward in a straight line abreast across the center of the field. Kowalski looked at the colonel's spotless uniform, realized there was no arguing with the man, and walked back to the radio operator. He picked up the handset and called back to the regimental command post, reporting that the battalion was about to advance directly into interlocking automatic fire without armor support or smoke cover. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up directly behind the battalion command post, the metal frame covered in a thick layer of white road dust. The 2 silver stars on his helmet gleamed sharply in the late afternoon sun, and the ivory grips of his revolvers rested against his hips. He stepped out of the vehicle before it came to a complete stop, his movements deliberate and cold. Every officer and clerk in the tent immediately snapped to attention, the sudden silence heavy and absolute. Patton did not look at the maps on the tables. He did not look at the radios. He walked directly toward the front of the tent, where the battalion commander stood holding his leather riding crop. The general did not raise his voice, but the quiet intensity of his words carried to every man in the room. Patton studied the colonel for a long moment before asking how many men were currently down in the pasture. Prescott cleared his throat and replied that 87 men had been listed as casualties during the initial advance. Patton then asked if the battalion had deployed smoke or waited for the armored vehicles to clear the tree line. Prescott shook his head, stating that he believed speed and momentum would carry the line through the automatic fire. Patton asked a final question, demanding to know what specific military manual from the Great War or the frontier campaigns justified marching infantry abreast across a flat 200-meter killing zone. Prescott lowered his eyes and muttered that he had relied on the traditional principles of cavalry doctrine Believing that tactical boldness could overcome any fixed mechanical defense, Patton stepped closer, his voice dropping an octave as he addressed the standing officer. He stated that the colonel had chosen to live in a fantasy of horses and sabers while sending young Americans to bleed in the dirt. He noted that the enemy was not firing muzzle-loading muskets from the 19th century, but belt-fed machine guns that fired 1,200 rounds every single minute. He pointed out that Master Sergeant Kowalski had mapped a perfect covered approach through the northern tree line, a practical route that would have preserved the battalion and taken the objective without losing a single squad. He explained that a commander who valued his personal arrogance over the lives of his men had no place in a modern army. He concluded by giving the colonel a single binary choice, ordering him to either hand over his riding crop and accept an immediate reassignment to a rear area supply depot, or face an immediate general court-martial for gross tactical negligence in the field. Prescott stood completely frozen, his face turning a deep crimson as he slowly placed his leather crop onto the folding table. The punishment was carried out before the entire regimental staff, just behind the frontline positions. A detail of military policemen led the former commander out into the center of the muddy encampment, where the remaining officers of the battalions stood gathered in a silent circle. The afternoon air smelled heavily of diesel exhaust, scorched gunpowder, and the wet earth turned over by passing tank treads. Prescott stood at rigid attention as the order of relief was read aloud by a young lieutenant whose voice shook slightly in the stillness. Every eye was fixed on the middle-aged officer as his service coat was unbuttoned, and the silver insignia of his rank were clipped from his shoulders. The leather riding crop he had carried from Fort Riley was snapped cleanly in two pieces by a towering sergeant, the sharp crack of the wood echoing against the canvas tents. The broken pieces were dropped into the mud at his feet. Witnesses watched in absolute silence, none of the younger officers daring to break formation or look toward the disgraced man as he was stripped of his authority. He was loaded into the back of a canvas-covered supply truck destined for a rear area depot, leaving his shattered career in the dirt. Frank Kowalski returned to Pittsburgh after the conflict ended and went back to his job in the steel industry. He never spoke about the flat field west of Le Mans to his family or his neighbors, preferring to leave the memories of the European theater behind him in the dirt. He focused on his work, raised 3 children, and lived a quiet, industrious life before passing away in 1978. His family only discovered the full extent of his combat actions when they found his old maps and discharge papers stored in a cedar chest in the attic. Douglas Prescott lived out the remainder of his life in Lexington, Kentucky, surrounded by the equestrian culture he had refused to abandon. He never regained his former military standing and spent his retirement years writing bitter letters to the War Department, claiming that his tactical theories had been misunderstood by modern commanders. He died in obscurity in 1961, still maintaining that speed and shock value were the superior elements of combat leadership. His name was largely forgotten by the men who served under him, remembered only as a cautionary tale within the regimental history. Patton kept the detailed after-action report from the incident locked inside his personal desk drawer for the rest of his campaign. He never made a public statement about the replacement of the battalion commander, but he wrote a brief note to a fellow officer several weeks later. He wrote that an army could always replace lost equipment and broken weapons, but it could never replace the experience of a veteran soldier. He noted that a leader who could not distinguish between a horse charge and a machine gun emplacement belonged in a history museum rather than a forward command post. Some historians have argued that senior Allied commanders were overly harsh on officers who failed to adapt to the rapid technological changes of the era, suggesting that decades of peacetime doctrine could not be unlearned in a single campaign. They point out that tactical errors were common across all regiments during the chaotic breakout from Normandy. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that the uncompromising removal of outdated leaders was absolutely necessary to prevent further pointless waste of American lives. What is certain is that after the swift intervention west of Le Mans, the use of proper reconnaissance, smoke cover, and coordinated armor support became standard procedure throughout the entire sector. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply reassigned the colonel without a public ceremony? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when old hierarchies met new realities, make sure to subscribe.